event attendees to use the chat function as we go along. Probably not going to have a huge amount of time for questions at the end, so all of our speakers are going to pick up questions basically as we go and do their best to answer them sort of as part of the event. So very excited about our panel of speakers tonight who are joining us from Australia to Switzerland to Italy to here in the UK. And a big thank you to the Take Action Group for Refugees and Migrants, MSF UK's Take Action Group for Refugees and Migrants, for organising this event tonight and organising such an exciting panel of speakers. Just to briefly explain what the Take Action Group is. MSF UK is a membership organisation. We have an association, and the Take Action Group is made up of members who have signed up to do exactly that, to take action in the UK on behalf of unmet health needs in particular, but not only of refugees and migrants. They are a group of MSFers who basically join up their experience working with MSF elsewhere with the experience and what they're witnessing, often through being NHS practitioners or being involved in the refugee and migration sort of system in one way or another. So their role, basically what they've been doing, is joining those things up in order to be able to, speak to the impact of the policies of the British government. One very concrete thing that they have undertaken is psychological first aid training to volunteer groups that are working in immigration detention centres. And if you want any more information about their work, then I know that Clea is going to add a few things into the chat, and Clea, please do supplement if I missed anything. I talked about Take Action joining up MSF's experience elsewhere with the needs of refugees and migrants here in the UK, and they've been doing that in the context of MSF the organisation, not working in the UK. That has changed very recently. So with the significant deterioration in the situation with the use of contingency accommodation to house refugees and migrants, asylum seekers, given the pressure on the UK asylum system today, MSF in the UK conducted an assessment to see if we could usefully fill unmet needs from the perspective of asylum seekers. And that has led to a small scale project which is focused on the contingency accommodation. We have had access to Napier Barracks. We are going to start some small scale activities there in the weeks to come. And we're also looking at the other hotels and centres that asylum seekers are currently being housed in on a temporary basis. The objectives of that project is a continuation of the work that Take Action have been doing in terms of the provision of psychological first aid from MSF staff, but also importantly capacity building for volunteers and accommodation staff, so really frontline workers who are kind of in contact with asylum seekers every day. We're looking to generally improve the situation for asylum seekers, for the asylum seekers into contingency accommodation, in terms of access to healthcare, and then to support the sort of ongoing advocacy and policy efforts of the Take Action Group itself, but also other civil society organisations. I emphasise that this is a very small effort in what we know has been a worsening situation over recent years. And obviously with the new immigration plan, that looks set to deteriorate even further with a plan that seems to be almost by design intended to cause tremendous harm to those who have the temerity not to wait in the queue, when in reality we know that there is no queue, and that formal refugee settlement programs are not today offering desperate, vulnerable people a reasonable alternative. And we also know that the category between refugee and migrant with climate change, with environmental degradation, with chronic underdevelopment, with human trafficking, that those distinctions become ever more blurred. And that's in fact what we really need to be doing, is thinking about it through the lens of vulnerable people and what their needs are. So that's the backdrop to MSF starting to work in the UK in this domain. And on that note, I am going to hand over to our first speaker. So I'm going to introduce each speaker as they start, rather than go through the entire panel. So very happy to hand over to Zoe Gardner. So Zoe is joining us from the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants and is a policy advisor, and she will speak to that policy, that worsening policy environment that I referred to. Zoe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and thank you all for having me today. It's really good to be here and to talk to you about this really key moment that I think we're living through at the moment in terms of policy towards migrants and refugees. This government's really deliberately hostile approach. So I just thought I'd situate a little bit of the Priti Patel's nasty new plan for immigration, what it really means in practice, how it is in some ways a really big departure and a really dangerous and important moment in what's happening and a sort of change, and at the same time replicates the same failed logic and the same basis of sort of denial of reality and of people's needs that we've actually been seeing for decades. Not just in the UK, but also around the world, and increasingly so. So I'm really glad to also be here with colleagues who can speak to the situation around Europe and around the world, because I think that it's really important to see this issue and how it's being pursued in the UK in that context. So I'm really, really grateful to be here on such a great panel. So the key issue that I'm sure everybody on this call is aware of is that there isn't any visa, any pathway, any route for a person to come to the UK for the purpose of seeking asylum. So even though there's this sort of contradiction between the absolute right that we subscribe to under the Geneva Convention, the Convention on Refugees, for a person to seek asylum from persecution, we do not grant people the right to come here in order to do so. So it's a massive contradiction that vastly limits this, absolutely fundamentally important right, which is based on the need to protect people from potentially deadly violence and persecution. We have not had any regulated visa routes, safe routes, pathways to protection. There's all sorts of different ways of talking about it. We have not had any pathways to protection available for ever. It's never been part of the refugee protection regime in the UK to have a visa route for people to come and make their asylum claims here. We've had very, very limited resettlement programs, and now this government is trying to co-opt the language of safe routes and the language of protection and bringing people directly to this country in order to seek protection, and sort of limit it and box it off in reference only to resettlement. And resettlement is about taking people who have been recognized as refugees and are living displaced potentially in refugee camps around the world and bringing them to build new lives in the UK. And it's a really valuable and important part of our refugee protection, but it's not the end of the story. And it is not fundamentally about bringing people here who are trying to seek protection. It's about people who have already been recognized as refugees, usually by the UN, and sometimes by other humanitarian actors around the world. And what we're really lacking, and what that approach denies, if it's taken just on its own, is the agency and the individual strength, courage, and hope for the future that it takes for a refugee to pick themselves up out of a dangerous, potentially deadly situation and make their own way to a safe country and make their own way to protection. And this is something that human beings have done throughout history, always have done, always will do. It's not something that can be stopped or made to disappear. Now, this nasty new plan for immigration seeks to deny the right to asylum to anybody who makes that journey off their own back. So anybody who arrives in the UK and says that they've been a victim of persecution and they're fleeing persecution or they're fleeing war, that person, according to this new law, which actually through secondary legislation has already been put into place to a large degree, but which Priti Patel is seeking to bring with a new bill before Parliament this summer, would deny the fact that those people are refugees and needed protection in this country, and would deny them even access to the asylum procedure. So fundamentally what this means is that already our clients at JCWI, if they're arriving in the UK not through resettlement routes, which is almost everybody, I mean, it's the vast majority of refugees who come to seek protection in the UK don't come through resettlement routes. They are being served with a letter that says that their claim is inadmissible under the UK system, and that the Home Secretary is now going to pause their claim for asylum, house them in, as we've seen, as I'll get to, incredibly inadequate conditions, and hold them in limbo while she goes off and tries to cut a deal with any other country around the world to take them off our hands. Now, obviously, if she manages to cut a deal of this kind, to send seekers of sanctuary away from the UK to any other country, be that a European country or further afield, that would be a serious violation of those people's rights and of the obligations that the UK has under international law to protect refugees. But more likely than her actually sending many people away under this new process, Priti Patel can't explain to any other country, nor to us, why she thinks any other country should take our asylum responsibilities off our hands. And it's quite hard, actually, to convince another country to take in asylum seekers just because. We've left the EU, so we've left the processes by which we would do that with other European countries. And we haven't got in place any other arrangements, either to send people to other European countries anymore or further afield. So what's likely to happen to these people who Priti Patel has served this letter to, saying, no, your claim is inadmissible off this completely arbitrary rubbish ground that you have made your own way to seek protection. What's likely to happen to them is that they will wait in this limbo situation for an additional 6 months. And the government has given itself 6 months to find somewhere else to send people. But then it's also said that's not the end of the process. If we want to take longer, we will. But at least an additional 6 months of people waiting within the asylum system before they will then have the right to have their claim examined, like any other asylum seeker, like we have had for asylum seekers traditionally in this country. If you arrive and you enter the system, and then you have an interview and your claim is assessed to see if you are genuinely fleeing persecution and if you have the right to stay here. So she's logging in an extra 6 months minimum for most asylum seekers to just be trapped in a sort of limbo situation in this country. And we've seen, and I think actually we'll hear directly from somebody with experience of it, but we've seen in the press as well recently a case that JCWI, my organization, was involved with, challenging conditions in those accommodation centers, which are de facto detention centers, where conditions are absolutely squalid, wholly inadequate, especially for the vulnerable population that we're talking about. So extending the limbo situation of people waiting in the asylum system. And then once she's had to concede that she hasn't found somewhere else to just palm them off to, she's proposing that even when these people have gone through the asylum process and when they have been recognized as refugees, so as people who have fled persecution and have an international right to remain in this country, that she will only grant those people a temporary protection status. And this, again, replicates the same old logic and the failed logic of the rest of her immigration system. We've done some research at JCWI recently, which looked at these temporary status that people have. Most migrants are on temporary status. And what she's proposing to put refugees on, recognized refugees, people who fled persecution, I can't say it enough because it just blows my mind. People who've been accepted as having fled persecution to go on a 10-year route to permanent status here in the UK, and to be denied access to the social security net that we all rely on, and which, of course, these people in particular will have need of relying on, because they are, by definition, people who have fled trauma and abuses and may not, and need the support of the state in order to rebuild their lives and to be able to thrive here. And what she's proposing is to put them on this 10-year route, where 4 times throughout those 10 years, so every 2.5 years, they will have to reapply for their right to be here, and reapply and reprove that they are indeed at risk of persecution elsewhere. So she's talking about a massive destabilization in the rights of people, in the lives of people who have been recognized as refugees, even after having extended their asylum process in the first place. And this is a government that is deliberately introducing far greater bureaucratic complexity, quite aside from the cruelty that this represents for people's lives, for the inability of them to rebuild their lives, people who've escaped danger, who need stability more than anything, and need to feel that sense of safety. She's introducing vast amounts more bureaucratic hurdles for her own department. So an extra 6 months for almost everybody in the asylum system, plus 4 renewals on their asylum status throughout over the course of 10 years. So you're increasing the load, the bureaucratic load of the Home Office by 4 or 5 times just from the outset. And this is a Home Office that has a history of incredibly poor decision making. Roughly half, it goes up and down a little bit, but around half of people who are initially refused asylum in this country and take it to appeal then are found to actually have had the wrong decision made on their claim, and that they do need protection. So this is a department that makes poor decisions. This is a department where the backlog of people waiting for their asylum claim to be determined has gone up this last year, at the same time as numbers of asylum seekers have gone down by a quarter. So this is a department that is not handling in any sort of, by any measure, by any metric, human rights defenders metric or their own metric, is not handling its asylum responsibilities at all adequately, has just lost a court case for, false imprisonment and inadequate housing of asylum seekers, and is seeking to vastly increase its own responsibilities in this area. It's a recipe for complete disaster. It's a recipe for people falling out of the system and becoming undocumented. It's a recipe for people becoming re-traumatized by being held in pseudo detention for months at a time with no certainty over their future. It's a recipe simply for chaos. And I truly believe, and I think, what Vicky said in her excellent introduction really sort of speaks to this as well. I really believe that this is a deliberate attempt to sow more chaos. There are solutions. There have been solutions that all experts across the board on refugee and asylum protection have been banging the drum about for years and years. We need more legal routes to migration. We need travel documents to be available to people at our border to enter the UK asylum system. These are the solutions that provide people with an alternative to make these journeys safely and to come here and build their lives and live here safely. You can't make them disappear. We've been trying to make them disappear from our border in France for at least 30 years with our juxtaposed controls, from the camp that was called Sangat to being called the jungle to now it doesn't have a name, but there's still people camping out in northern France, desperate to come here because they have good reasons and good connections to the UK. And frankly, because they won't just disappear. There are solutions, and she knows about them just as well as anybody else. But this government is ideologically committed to obtaining the chaos and the front page stories that show them up to be monstrous, that show them up to be cruel, that show them up to be denying people's rights, because they believe that there is mass support for that in this country. And so I'm not going to keep going on and on and on forever, because it is really truly depressing. But I think that if I can end to say I don't agree with them, I don't actually think that's true. I think that we saw with the Windrush scandal, we saw with, thousands of people getting out on the streets in Glasgow just a couple of weeks ago. And we've seen with just literally this afternoon, a successful campaign of local community, family and friends of a young autistic man called Osumi Brown, who was facing deportation back to Nigeria. He's just had his deportation order revoked on the basis of the protests. I think we see that when, people may support control in the abstract, but in the practical sense, people are not cruel. People support their neighbors. People want to protect refugees, and they want people to be able to just settle down and build a life here. They don't want to see dangerous, chaotic journeys and people arriving in small boats, but they don't want cruelty and denial and more chaos, which is what these plans bring. And so I think that we all have a responsibility to stand up at the moment, let our representatives know that Priti Patel is wrong and that the mass of people in the UK do not support this cruelty. And that's the only way that we can really turn the tide on this, is to challenge that narrative that, well, people, maybe we make some mistakes, but people just want this cruelty. I don't believe we do. And I believe that we really, really need to make our voices heard, that we don't want this cruelty, that we want a functioning system that treats people with dignity. So I urge people here to support the brilliant work of TAG, the Take Action group. Take action, it's in the name, do the thing. We also, JCWI, and I'll put a link in the box, we have a few Write to Your MP tools, and we have this policy, as I say, that I've been developing for just travel documents for people to reach the UK to seek asylum. So please do contact your representatives, please do support the campaigns, and please do, challenge this narrative that we support this cruelty, because we don't. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the rest of you, and any questions, of course, I'd be happy to go into any more detail. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, Zoe, and thank you also for leaving us with some ideas for what kind of practical action people can take, because I think it does seem overwhelming at times in relation to the sort of the political kind of construct and the quest for electoral success that seems to often actually to underpin much of this. So I'm on that note, I am going to hand it over to Aaron. You can already see his slide come up. So Aaron is advocacy advisor for MSF in Australia. And Aaron is going to talk to us about some of MSF's experience in relation to offshoring in terms of refugees and migrants and asylum seekers. And I think just to make the link to what Zoe was also saying, I think obviously whilst that I think today doesn't form part of the immigration plan, we're pretty well aware that that is not off the table as far as the British government are concerned. And Zoe, maybe you could just put a quick comment on that in the chat. So Aaron, over to you.
Thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Zoe, as well for that. I would say a really interesting presentation, because it seems like this is where Australia was about 10 years ago. But anyway, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose stolen lands I work and live. I'd like to acknowledge the ongoing struggles and that this land was stolen, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So good evening to you all. It's good morning for me here in Australia. The title of my presentation, I'm calling it Indefinite Despair, and it's really the title of an MSF report whose findings demonstrate the negative impact of offshore processing on the mental health of refugees and asylum seekers in Australia, and is really attributed to the policies of Australia's offshore thing. So who am I? I'm a Tamil. I was born to a refugee family. We fled Sri Lanka because of violence and landed in Australia some 30 years ago. And I speak today as part of the Tamil community, but also from MSF Australia, as a former head of mission and now an advocacy advisor for MSF Australia. So where are we now? I'm going to give you the key points of my presentation. And here it is. It's Australia does not have a refugee and asylum seeker policy. It has a border protection and a national security policy. Now that distinction is extremely, extremely important for the reasons that Zoe mentioned before. It's an extremely hostile environment which undermines the absolute principles of international law and refugee law. And, you know, whether it be political feuds or punitive measures, at the heart of it, it is undermining these laws. And its effect is that thousands of people have been subject to real draconian measures impacting on their health and lives, far more than some of the events that they were fleeing itself. The other aspect of the points that I'm going to make today is that mental health suffering that we recorded in Nauru on a cohort of people who were detained offshore was largely attributed to the Australian government's policy rather than to the events that they were fleeing from. But underpinning all of this, I'm speaking to you from the future as a warning, quite literally because I'm in Australia, but really this policy has been tried in Australia and it hasn't been tested. It hasn't worked. And here we are right now, quite, I think, appalled that other countries like the UK are planning to take this policy on board. It's really saddening for us because we're seeing the kind of dribs and drabs of the effect that it's having on people's lives, and I'll talk a little bit about that too, where we're at. So let's talk a little bit about the Pacific Solution Policy. That's what it's called. Let's call it, a solution. It's really in the title, isn't it? It's looking at it like a problem rather than an obligation to protection. But it really is a deterrence policy. So if we go through a few of the key dates, it really started in September 2001 when our Prime Minister, John Howard, refused to allow 432 refugees from entering, which is now widely known as the Tampa incident. Now that was a conservative government. During that time as well, we saw a boat that kind of that sunk and some people were drowning. And the rhetoric around that was, what started as a rhetoric to save people from drowning quickly turned to people smugglers and quickly turned to change to criminalizing the refugees themselves. And that's rhetoric I'm already hearing from Zoe, what you're saying has already started to come into play. Now, the next step up, if you don't mind, if someone can just...
can everybody check they're on mute, please?
Cool, thank you.
Right,
then the next step that happened was in July. There's a lot that happened, but the next major incident that happened was in July 2013. This was after the wars of Syria had begun, after the end of the Sri Lankan civil war happened. Australian PM Kevin Rudd, who is, our let's say, who was our last one of our was from the Labour Party, which is not our Conservative Party in Australia, declared no one arriving by boat will settle in Australia. The reason why I highlight this is that it's not just Conservative push. It's also both our parties have had this rhetoric as well. So quite a familiar experience in Australia. Then in September 2013, Operation Sovereign Borders came into force under a new Conservative government, and all boat arrivals after this announcement were sent to Nauru, a small island country in the Pacific, and Manus Island in PNG, and some were detained in Australia. This was, of course, a deterrence policy. This was basically telling refugees that if you try to come by boat to Australia, you will not be resettled here permanently, despite your refugee status, despite any claim that you make. So since 2013, 3,127 people were sent offshore with no resettlement option in Australia. So where are we right now? So I think I'll move on from the context a little bit, and go to where are we? So what did MSF do in response to this? I think that's what might be interesting for us to hear now. So what did MSF Australia do? MSF, what we did in November 2017 was we opened up a one door for all psychological and mental health program, which included psychiatric care. The service was available to locals on Nauru as well as asylum seekers and refugees on Nauru. And this was permission that was granted by the Nauruan government and also Australia. MSF also worked on building up local capacity to treat mental health disorders, on increasing awareness of mental health issues, and on decreasing stigma within the local community towards mental health illnesses. In October, after 11 months of us providing healthcare, the Nauruan government ordered MSF to end its work providing mental health care on Nauru, claiming that we had conspired against it to advance political agendas. We described the mental health situation of asylum seekers and refugees on Nauru as beyond desperate. And yes, we were prepared to advocate and to speak out on behalf of our patients, and that led to us being kicked out. We were given 24 hours notice to cease activities. And I think one of the biggest, I don't think we regret at all doing that intervention. I don't think we regret at all planning to speak out. But what we do regret, and one of the lessons learned, was that there was no continuity of care for this cohort of patients that we just had to leave and abandon. And that still, I think, is a big thing that we have to reckon. So I'm going to go over a little bit of the mental health situation of the people, so that we focus on a bit of the medical and the health impacts. So the GAF score is, it's called the Global Assessment of Functioning. It measures the extent to which a patient's symptoms affects his or her daily life on a scale of 1 to 100. 91 to 100 indicates optimal mental health and coping abilities. 71 to 90 is categorized as healthy. A GAF score of 40 generally represents a major impairment in several areas of their life simultaneously. What we can see here is we can really see that everything is below 35. It's really low in people that are under 20, and it's about 30 to 40. But regardless, the median score of this is well below a healthy score mental health wise, and it has extreme consequences to people. This is no longer a socialization or a temporary issue. This represents a real clinical and widespread kind of issue for the refugees and the asylum seekers that we saw. If we look at now the mental health morbidities amongst the refugees and asylum seeker patients, 62% of them had moderate and severe depression, 25% had anxiety disorder, 18% had PTSD. And now the list goes on in terms of morbidities, but those were the main ones. 62% having moderate severe depression, that presents an epidemic and a public health crisis, really. Now, the data that we collected, and not just from the statistics, but also from speaking to people, it shows that the mental health suffering was largely attributable to the situation of being held indefinitely in offshore detention, rather than a result of previous trauma. Now, as someone who has fled trauma myself, fled violence and war, I was lucky, man. I got to come back to Australia, but to be said that the situation in detention is worse than what we were fleeing, that says a lot. It is the Australian government's policy that is causing harm here, mostly. Beyond that, there's a really jarring statistic that I want to share with you, that 65%, that's 135 refugee and asylum seeker patients that were seen by us, had suicidal ideation or engaged in self-harm or suicidal acts. Children as young as 9 were found to have suicidal ideation and had committed acts of self-harm or attempted suicide. Suicide attempts increased amongst refugees and asylum seekers in Nauru for both MSF patients and those not seen by MSF. Now, this is an expected and unfortunate predictable consequences of long-term indefinite processing. I'd like to read out to you also a testimony from Kazem, who's an Iranian refugee who'd been held on Nauru for more than 5 years. So the main thing that has caused us to suffer too much is about the future. We were recognized as refugees in 2014, but we still don't know about our future. We applied to be settled in the US, and we recently got the negative results. The decision has affected us so much. I still don't know how long it will take to get out of here. This is really hard. Now, that's 5 years of being held on Nauru. I'll go back to my original sentence to kind of ground what Australia did. We do not have a refugee and an asylum seeker policy, because at every step of the way, we were undermining the core principles. First of all, if we talk about the legal principle or the principle of resettlement, we were just asking other countries to take over, and we're abdicating our responsibility to resettle these people in Australia. We were sending them to the US. We were trying to find other countries to take them without an interrogation of why we were doing that. The principle of protection, I think Zoe had already mentioned the principle of protection. Indeed, we undermine this principle of protection when we subject these people to even more harm than what they were fleeing. We undermine the principle of protection as well when we deny them an opportunity to claim asylum and refugee status in Australia. And last and I think not last, actually, this is one but this is one that I really wanted to highlight that Zoe touched upon. It's called the principle of credibility. We have under-resourced, purposefully, I believe, under-resourced our vetting processes. We have under-resourced our social services processes. So indeed, we weren't able to vet or to make concrete cases for each of the refugees as they were individually in Australia when they were claiming asylum or claiming refugee status. So of course you got a whole bunch of people that didn't have legitimate refugee claims. Of course, when you send these people back to Sri Lanka, for example, and they say that it's actually okay to go back, it's fine in Sri Lanka, there is no issue there. That is completely insulting to anyone who is Tamil, who's anyone who has fled violence, to say that it's fine to go back because there's a certain amount of people that, yeah, they came here as refugees and they went back because everything's fine. That's because they didn't do the refugee and the vetting system process properly. Now, that's something I can see the UK heading towards. That's something that Australia had done already. And we don't believe that this was the conspiracy of incompetence. We do believe that this was purposefully done. It was undermining core principles that affected people's lives in the end. My take on this is that the refugee migration policies of Australia is part of a racist, xenophobic, and nationalist position, and part of the broader kind of border militarization complex that Australia is heading towards. And it all starts with that undermining and circumventing of refugee and international law. Where are we right now? We have 157 refugees left in our offshore detention cohort. They're still in Madison, Nauru. We have 10,000 people on bridging visas whose fate is yet to be determined, but they are some of them, from Sri Lanka, I could say, are being told that they can go back because there's no problem in Australia, in Sri Lanka. Their lives are in limbo. Some of their family members are still in Sri Lanka. I know a man who's been here for 8 years, who has been through detention programs and still hasn't seen his family in 8 years, and has been rejected twice now. His asylum and refugee claim. In a very dramatic effect, in the last kind of court hearing, they asked, "What evidence do you have of your persecution?" And he just took his shirt off and showed his back that was ripped apart from torture. And this is someone who has been repeatedly been denied a claim to refugee. Yep, indeed, this law worked. This policy absolutely worked. It worked as a deterrent, but it failed in upholding international law, and it failed the refugees, and which is simply, for me, a failure. Now, I understand why those who originally supported the offshore processing were moved by the tragic drownings of men, women, and children who were trying to desperately reach Australia's shores, to embrace policies and practices seeking to end the boats and stop smugglers. But this is a false and very disingenuous logic in saving people at sea, only then to mistreat them and neglect them on land. Now, when faced with overwhelming evidence of harm and neglect that we just saw now, we must acknowledge that good intentions cannot justify this. The current policy is really an abject failure. A proper approach by Australia has to include, at minimum, solutions for all the refugees, asylum seekers sent to Papua New Guinea and Nauru, and an end to offshore processing. We as MSF, I think, we're concerned that, asylum seekers and refugees held offshore, as well as those medically evacuated to Australia, do not have adequate access to healthcare. Ultimately, I think I'll end this by saying there is no therapeutic solution for asylum seekers and refugees until they're permanently and voluntarily settled in a place of safety. I will end there with my email if anyone would like to get in touch, and I will be around to answer some questions in the chat if you're available. But otherwise, back to you, Vicky. Thank you all for the Excellent work that you're doing there. It's as you said before, it is a small effort, but it is super important because you don't want to end up where we are right now. It's a defeated feeling. It's a depressive feeling where even the smallest victories, such as yesterday, a family of 4 who have been detained on an island for the last 3 years was allowed to resettle was not allowed to resettle, sorry, was allowed to just granted temporary detention, community detention in Australia. That for us was a major victory. They haven't been given any protection guarantees. They haven't been given any, the government is still telling them that they're going to be sent back to Sri Lanka. And that for us represents a victory. And I think that shows you how desperate we are, hoping you guys don't get to that point. But yeah, thank you. I'll hand it back to Vicky.
Great. Thanks a lot, Aaron. And as Aaron has said, he's going to stay with us for a little bit longer, but probably not the whole time, given that it is 4:15 in Australia. So if you have questions for Aaron, then get them in quick. So I think Aaron's words sort of very effectively conveyed the lengths to which governments are prepared to go in terms of their policies of deterrence. And Marco is, I'm afraid, going to continue on a similar theme. Can you hear me okay? There's an echo now. I've moved. Is it okay? Oh, that's better. Okay. Sorry, I moved because there was just too much noise. Yeah, so Marco is going to continue on a similar theme in terms of really describing some of the human impact of those policies of deterrence. Marco is joining us from Italy. Oh, sorry, it's Emily next. Sorry, I've got the running order wrong. So Emily is going to talk to us about the conditions in some of the camps that MSF is working on in the Greek islands. She is an advocacy advisor based with MSF in Switzerland and author of a new MSF report released last week. Emily, I'll hand it over to you to tell us a little bit more about that report. And sorry, Marco, to put you to give you a full start. Emily, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Vicky, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. And yeah, it's a bit depressing to hear from the 2 previous speakers, but it's also yeah, I mean, everything that you guys are saying as well. I'm afraid I'm going to say more of the same. And at least I hope to illustrate a bit how the Greece experience could be used as well as a sharp warning about the UK's proposed immigration policies that are coming up, and I hope you guys can fight them indeed. Yeah, so as Vicky explained, I am one of the authors on a new report. I want to also give a big shout out to my colleague Reem, based in Brussels, and also all the other advocacy colleagues that work together on the new report, which I think we can share with you. The key point to really highlight is that it's Europe's dangerous approach to migration that is the cause of the medical humanitarian crisis we see in Greece on the Greek island hotspots. It's avoidable, predictable, and policy driven. And the title of the new report is Constructing a Crisis at Europe's Borders. So really, it is a constructed crisis to deter people. It's a dangerous deterrence model, and it doesn't have to be this way. It's why MSF has been speaking out about the situation in Greece now for 5 years, the 5 years particularly since the EU-Turkey deal, which fortified the border and caused the containment and the processing of asylum on the 5 Greek island hotspots. 3 of which MSF has been working on, Chios, Lesbos, and Samos. So we draw experience from the years of working on those 3 islands. And really what this has shown, looking at all this experience, at the testimonies that we gathered from patients and the medical data The hotspot approach is a complete disaster. It leads to indefinite containment, appalling living conditions, expanding detention, violent pushbacks, rapid border procedures that fail to identify vulnerabilities, and an extremely traumatic asylum process. So altogether, this is working as a system that's inflicting misery, it's making people sick, and it's really eroding the right to asylum. And when Moria burnt down last year, and we heard from the European Commission that there would be no more Morias, we hope that would be the case. It's of course not the case at all. There has been no change in approach. So the EU has ignored similar facilities on the other islands. And the COVID pandemic as well should really have been the last straw to abandon these cramped encampment facilities. But instead, the EU is doubling down on its dangerous approach. It's building even more restrictive centres, such as one that I've recently seen on Samos, where we work. It's a much larger facility in a very remote location on the island, surrounded by high barbed wire fencing. It will have controlled entry and exit, and there's even a playground built there, surrounded by barbed wire. So clearly, children will also be locked up in this facility, or that is the intention. So these new restrictive centres, combined with the European Commission's proposals in the new Migration Pact, together these really are intending to keep people out of Europe, or at least keep people locked up until they could be returned or pushed out of Europe. There's really nothing to offer more protection or asylum to people. So the message and the strategy is clear. It's to detain, to deport, and to deter people from coming to Europe at all. But in the meantime, there's still 10,000 people stuck on the Greek island hotspots. One person we spoke to when we were compiling the report described being stuck there as being dying without ending. It really is a horrible limbo that people are left in. There's really high levels of mental health distress. It's hard to describe. The data that you can see in the report demonstrates this. So in 2019 and 2020, 180 people sought care with MSF after self-harm or attempted suicide. 2/3 of them were children, and the youngest was just 6 years old. So it's shocking, and yet the policies continue. The majority of people arriving to the Greek islands have already been exposed to violence and hardship, as the previous speakers also explained. And we also see that among the MSF patients in the mental health clinics, so the majority are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. It means they've already been exposed to traumatic events. And yet they're often they're kept still in this awful and violent situation. So the major stresses that are impacting the mental health patients are the living conditions, a continued exposure to violence, and an unsupported and traumatic asylum process, and lack of information about their status. So we conclude, of course, that these hotspots are simply not safe or healthy places for people who are seeking asylum. Yet, yes, what we're seeing, unfortunately, it's why we're also speaking out now with the full report. The EU is sending millions of euros to Greece for the building of these new multi-purpose centres, these more restrictive centres. So there's an investment in security and border protection and control, but they're not even still today providing the very basics. So MSF and other NGOs continually have to step in just to ensure that people have access to basic healthcare and to water. So since October 2019 to date, MSF has trucked in 43 million litres of safe drinking water for people living in the Vathi reception centre on Samos. So MSF is doing what it can to provide care and to treat people and to provide the basic necessities, be supportive. But in the end, it's very challenging for the medical staff, because they have to, people come to the clinic and then they have to go back into this place of harm. That people are restricted, you see, to the islands, to the hotspots. They cannot move from there for the duration of their asylum process, which is often takes a long time. So there's geographic restrictions that keep people on these islands. With the new centres, they're going to further segregate people from the rest of society, make them even more invisible and locked up. So there's an expansion of detention facilities as well as part of these new centres. So detention's becoming much more the norm rather than a measure of last resort. And the new centre that's being built on Samos will have detention capacity for 900 people. That's just on one of the 5 islands. And really, the EU is describing these new centres astonishingly as an improvement in the living conditions. So as MSF, we're speaking out strongly to say, no, it's completely false, and it's really it's only going to cause more harm. We only foresee a worsening mental health and protection crisis in these new centres. And I'll just read a quote out from somebody we spoke to for the report. His name is Ali, and he's 32 years old, from Syria. And he says, "Europe is a country of freedom, but why are you taking our freedom from us? You want us to be in prison. Being in that new camp, we will not be considered as refugees, but criminals." He says, if I had committed a crime, I could go to prison, but I haven't committed any crime. I'm just seeking asylum. I'm just a refugee. And this is unfortunately the trend that we see happening. People are painted as criminals, and they say that the way that they feel as well, that even animals are treated better than they are. And we see a normalization and a criminalization of the right to seek asylum. So fairly recently, a father was charged in Greek courts for putting his son's life at risk. His son drowned whilst trying to reach Samos Island. They were trying to seek safety, and the response from the Greek authorities is to criminally charge the father for putting his son's life at risk. So this is what we're seeing happening: a continued demonization and degrading of people seeking safety and a life in Europe. This is not a solution, though. It's really the root cause of the problem, and it's causing immense harm. So as MSF, we're calling for a complete change in the EU's approach to migration. We've been doing that for years, but we call once again for a complete change across Europe. I think the migration policies and narratives, they need to change away from this demonization and to treat these people as human beings who can actually contribute to society and want to restart their lives if they're given the chance. So we also, of course, want to see an end to this containment and deterrence policies that we see, and more investment in dignified and safe accommodation, a fair and transparent asylum system. I mean, it's amazing that you have to call for that. And more integration, of course, in communities for recognised refugees, because it's not covered in the report, but for those who do get refugee status and might be on the Greek mainland, unfortunately, the situation is not much better. People are living in camps or on the streets or in very unsafe places. But yeah, I think I wrap up there. It's not too late, I think, for this change. We just need to try and inject some common sense and some compassion into the political leaders and to try and galvanize support and speak up. So yeah, please do look at the report and share it widely and use it to challenge the UK's proposals. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Emily. And I have to say, one of the things that really strikes me as I listen to you talk is the complete hypocrisy of EU member states and governments like the UK that would have humanitarian representatives sitting in places like Bangladesh and Kenya, advocating towards those governments to uphold their protection responsibilities, but then when people seek exactly the same form of protection closer to home, then there's just a complete abandonment of it. Just incredible. Okay, on that note, over to Marco, who I think I have already introduced, but just to do it again, is advocacy advisor for head of humanitarian affairs for MSF in Italy, and he is going to particularly focus on our work in the Mediterranean. So Marco, over to you.
Very much. I hope you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can.
Yes, you can. Okay. Well, I have to say that it's not easy to take the floor after this tour of the world, in which the conclusion is that basically our generation probably failed to build up the global governance for peace, for security, but at the end of the day, there is a lot of coordination and a governance system against human mobility is in place and is in place that are basically mobility mainly of an healthy population around the globe. There's a lot of parallel that can be done between the experience in the UK now, in Greece, in Australia. I think also the rhetoric is very similar. The propaganda. I will try to stick to the focus of my presentation, which is basically sea crossing, in order also to discuss a bit the parallel on the component of the new policy in the UK covering the channel crossing. But I want to make a preliminary remark on that, which is please do not overlap, do not consider life-saving assistance at sea as part of migration policy. This is one of the main mistakes and one of the main propaganda discussion and statements that we need to avoid. I mean, we are not talking of migration policies, we are talking of state obligation deriving not from human rights or refugee law, but mainly deriving from sea law sea. And this is a big difference, because basically we don't need to see rescue at sea as part of migration policy. Rescue at sea is an obligation. It's a last resort strategy. At the end of the day, also the role of MSF, we are covering what states should do, but the reality is that search and rescue for migrants shouldn't exist, simply because we should advocate for migration policies that allow people to travel safely and to seek protection legally and safely without resorting to criminal channels or paying criminals to cross the sea in dangerous crossing. So this is a very basic introduction, but I think it helps to frame the discussion we should have on this subject. I've tried very quickly to summarize. Can you see the second page? Because I only see.
No,
maybe,
it doesn't.
Okay.
There you go. Now it's moved.
Okay, sorry. I have tried to quickly summarize several years of disasters and terrific and dangerous policies by European and Italian authorities, and I think it's very interesting to quickly go through what happened since 2008 to see how many times the same things have been repeated and how many times the same mistakes have been done. And I also think that you will be able to see some learnings and some things that can be also helpful for your discussion on the situation in the UK. I start from 2008 because you might remember that Italy signed a friendship treaty in 2008. Berlusconi signed this treaty, and this treaty included a number of agreements and even financial support from Italy, trying to basically to contract out to Libyan authorities the management of migration flows from across the Mediterranean, the central Mediterranean Sea. 2009 was a very interesting and dangerous year. We had 803 and 34 people that have been pushed back in 9 different operations by joint crew. Italy and Libya pulled together resources, and basically Italian patrol boats were given to Libya in order to carry out such interception that were often made also by Italian ship working in extraterritorial in international waters, and this pushback were justified both by the European Commission and by the Minister of Interior, also referring to the presence of UNHCR in the country, and so the situation in Libya is not that bad. We have the United Nations monitoring the situation, the human rights situation in the country, which is something that we keep on hearing in the current discussion with the Italian authorities. In 2012, and I want to give a very to first give this information of a first positive development when the European Court of Human Rights decided to condemn Italy for collective expulsion. It was the first time that European obligations were applied in an extraterritorial case, considering the capacity of the Italian authorities and the role of the Italian authorities in this collective pushback. And at the end of the day, direct pushback, directly managed by the Italian authorities, were blocked by that legal decision. And I think this is a very relevant step, a landmark decision that we need to take into consideration. I saw there was a discussion on the chat regarding the role of strategic litigation. I think sometimes strategic litigation might be useless, but there are situations in which it has helped to at least define basic principle and hold state authorities accountable for their behavior. Very recent decision by the European Court of Human Rights were disappointing, so I'm not saying that this is the key to solve any problem, but in the central Mediterranean history, I would say that the 2012 decision was a very relevant one to define certain obligation. And then we had in 2013 the shipwreck in Lampedusa, 2 different shipwrecks, and the decision by the Italian authorities to launch Mare Nostrum, which is the only proactive search and rescue operation ever launched by state authorities. This is the first and only time in which a state authority has decided to launch an operation on purpose, with the clear intention of launching a proactive search and rescue activity along the central Mediterranean route. 2015 and 2016, we are in a situation in which basically the Mare Nostrum operation was closed mainly for financial consideration. It was replaced by weak European operation whose mandate was not a search and rescue mandate, but it was more a mandate, an anti-trafficking mandate. And I see again a clear parallel with other countries, the rhetoric of anti-trafficking, the fight against traffickers of human traffickers is and the idea that by fighting human traffickers, basically you will and avoiding to have a dedicated search and rescue operation, you will also deter departure of people and you will decrease the mortality. This was the rhetoric of the Italian government and is the current rhetoric of the Italian government, but it was contradicted by facts. In 2015, we had the highest mortality rate. In 2016, if I remember well, we had 4,500 deaths at sea along the central Mediterranean route. Only in 1 week, in April 2015, 1,200 people lost their life into shipwrecks caused by basically intervention by private vessel who carried out the rescue not in the proper way. In that 2 years, we also had the biggest presence of search and rescue NGO running operation at sea. We reach a peak of 13 ships simultaneously operating in the central Mediterranean route. We had also a relevant role of merchant ship and private vessels. And of course, the presence of state authority was mainly a presence of military operation, of Frontex operation with a focus on anti-trafficking. And then we arrive in 2017. You all remember, and this is again a repetition of the 2008 bilateral deal. A new bilateral deal was signed by Italy in February 2017. There was a clear attempt to try to deter departures by financially supporting militias in Libya, which led us since the beginning of the summer of 2017 to a very relevant drop in departures from Libya, together with a process of criminalization of NGO, including through the imposition or the submission of this code of conduct, and the formal establishment of search and rescue region under the coordination of the Libyan Coast Guard, which from 2016 started to be trained by Italy and by European member states and European Uniform Med operation in order to delegate, which is basically what happened since 2018, the coordination of rescue activity in the very extensive and big SAR Libyan region to the Libya Coast Guard and the Libyan authorities, which basically led to a process of externalization of the management of the border management and of the rescue operation, by allowing in this way pushback and interception practices coordinated by Italian and European authorities, but then practically run by Libyan authorities. And we also have a role of merchant vessels that have been engaged by Italian and European authorities, and of course by Libyan authorities in a pushback. We only this morning we had 200 people that have been sent back to Tripoli by Vos Triton, a merchant vessel owned by the same company who rented the ship to MSF a couple of years ago. This company basically supported a request coming from the Libyan authorities to transfer rescued people that have been brought to detention center this morning, and our MSF team in a detention center was already able to meet and interview these people. 2018 and 2021 is also a time in which basically NGO activity at sea have been obstaculated or impeded, firstly through the closed port policy by the former government. You remember the time in which basically NGO vessels were forced to stay in standoff for several days, and or were not allowed to enter Italian territorial waters or Italian territorial or Italian ports. Now I would say that the criminalization or the strategy to boycott the role of civilian search and rescue vessels is still carried out by the current government. Couple of years ago, we were not allowed to enter Italian ports. Now we are not allowed to leave Italian ports, in the sense that Italian authorities are basically using the post-stay control mechanism, which is an international system to facilitate coordination among flagship states and post-states authorities in order to ensure compliance with technical requirements and to assess deficiencies for the safety of navigation. And this has been used in an abusive way by the Italian authorities in order basically to allow the detention and the administrative blockage of NGO ships. At the moment, we have 4 NGO ships that are stuck in Italian or Spanish port following an order by Italian authorities, and so basically the Italian authorities and the European authorities are now discussing the extension of the same system at the European level. We're able to find more sophisticated means to impede NGO and civil society organization to carry out search and rescue and life-saving activities at sea. I go quickly to wrap up with some trends that might be interesting to stress and to underline. Well, of course, the policies of non-assistance. What we see is not only lack of proactive search and rescue by state authorities, but we see a progressive disengagement of EU state authorities and the complete withdrawal of naval assets. Basically, European and Italian authorities are no longer coordinating search and rescue activities. Place of safety has become port of destination, which means that basically European authorities and Italian authorities do not consider anymore a situation of distress when they see migrants both trying to cross the sea, but they only consider that basically there are illegal access to territorial waters that are seized by migrants, and so basically they put in place anti-trafficking mechanism rather than search and rescue activities. Externalization of border control, this is something that I already stressed several times, but basically the idea is put in place a mechanism in order to facilitate pushback by proxy and externalization and delegation to Libyan authorities of things and the pushback that for Italian authorities would be easily considered as illegal and so legally challengeable. Obstruction of civilian activities, I already went through that quite extensively. Very quickly, there are interesting gaps also upon disembarkation. I think we made several step backs in the capacity of the Italian authorities to manage disembarkation. We observe a worsening in the first assistance and in the reception of rescue people. There are gaps in prompt identification of vulnerable cases. Mental health is a priority. This is the reason why in Italy we are focusing with our intervention specifically on victims of violence in Libya and gaps in the capacity of the Italian system to address mental health problems in rescued people and in general in migrant population. And then there is this black hole of the quarantine ship, which is a situation that started after the very first phase of the outbreak of COVID-19. The use of quarantine ship to manage the quarantine of rescued people, also people spontaneously reaching the country, and we see a lot of problems and also an anticipation of the pre-screening center and the accelerated procedure that are envisaging the EU Pact on Migration, and as far as I understand also in the UK policies that are due to be discussed in your country. Over for the moment.
Okay, thanks a lot, Marco. It was a very comprehensive rundown of the complete catalogue of tactics and strategies that have been deployed to prevent saving the very basic act of saving lives at sea, which, as you've pointed out, is nothing to do with migration policy. It's just simply about saving lives. On that note, I have great pleasure to hand over to Irfan, who is joining us tonight. Last, but as I said before, definitely not least. So Irfan is a former resident of Napier Barracks, who has since been active against the use of Napier as an asylum accommodation and is here to talk to us tonight about his experience. Over to you, Irfan.
Hello. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me, and especially thanks to our previous speakers. It was utterly shameful to hear what so many people have been through all around the world in the asylum system. To begin with, I was moved to Napier on mid-October last year, and I stayed there for 4 months. When I claimed asylum in September, I was accommodated in a hotel room for 3 weeks, and after 3 weeks, I was told that I'm gonna go to my next accommodation. When you receive a call about your next accommodation, you cannot predict where you're gonna go. If it's gonna be a dispersed accommodation, if it's gonna be a detention center, or if it's gonna be one of the army camps. So I was really stressed and anxious. And the taxi driver who was in charge to give me a lift to go to the army camp didn't tell me where we are going because he was afraid if I'm going to escape. So as soon as we arrived to Napier, I was really shocked, speechless. I couldn't really express how I feel because I totally felt that I went to prison, and it totally felt like prison. It's fences all around you, and There are so many people in one environment, and in each block, there are more than 20 people, and they are sharing 2 toilets and 2 showers. Each space for individual person is divided with wooden partitions, and which are open from the top. So so many people were living in one place, in one room, and so many people were sharing one dining room together, more than 200 people. And this happened during the pandemic. And I couldn't really believe, why am I there? And I could repeatedly ask myself, what have I done wrong that I deserve to living like this? And in the beginning, the first question that every resident would ask after going to Napier was, how long we are going to be here? And the response that they would get from the campus staff, camp manager, migrant help would be, you're going to stay here for approximately 1 month. So although being in Napier was really sad, but people would become hopeful that after 1 month they are going to go out and this is going to be over. So you could see that people were trying to amuse themselves for 1 month. In the first month that I was there in October, people were trying to conduct English classes, the residents themselves, for each other. They would participate in different activities, sports and playing games. And after some time, you could see the deterioration in their mental health. After 1 month, they realized that the information they received was not true, and they are going to stay there for a longer period of time. And whenever we were asking the campus staff and manager or migrant help, what is going to happen? What is going to happen with our asylum application? When we are going to move out? No one would give you any response. Everyone would say, we don't know. We don't know. No one knew. And being in limbo and being uninformed was really, really painful for the residents and for myself as well. So it was in January, in mid-January, that the COVID outbreak happened, which was really inevitable in the camp. I have to say that it was one block in the camp which has the first infected people, and there were 6 confirmed cases in the camp, and all they could do was to put fences all around that camp, that's a block, to isolate those infected ones. And after 2 or 3 days, they removed the fences and let the infected ones mix with other people in the camp, with other residents who were not COVID positive. And when we asked the camp manager why you are removing the fences, why you are mixing them with us, he said, because this camp is representing a house, and people in a household are free to mix with each other. And 1 week after, more than 200 people, half of the population of the camp, were infected with COVID-19, including me. We received no healthcare support, nothing to support us physically and mentally. And you could hear the sound of coughing and sneezing all over the camp. Half of the camp were infected. And we were thinking that maybe the government itself is not aware of what is happening in the camp, because we were quite isolated from the community. It totally felt like you are in a separate island from the community, from the rest of the world. So when I read what the Home Secretary and the Minister of Immigration, Chris Philip, tweeted on their Twitter account, that the people in the camp didn't practice social distancing. The residents themselves are to be blamed. They have to be blamed for the COVID outbreak. And that was the point that I realized I have to do something. They are spreading misinformation. They are lying, and people are not aware how the condition is inside of the camp. So although I was infected with the COVID, although I was not feeling really good, really well, I wrote a letter, and I collected 200 signatures from the other residents to sign the paper, and I did share it on social media to express how we are being treated in the camp and what these conditions are like. Maybe they can share the link to the letter I sent. And after that, I could become in contact with the former chief inspector of immigration, and we had the chance to talk to him about the conditions. We told him whatever happened in the camp, and he couldn't believe it. The first impression was he couldn't believe what we had been through. And during the inspection, when he visited the camps, the information he received from the staff and the camp manager was contradictory to what we were saying. They hid the information about the suicide attempts. We had few suicide attempts. I personally witnessed 3 of them. 2 people cut their wrists and 1 person hanged himself. And it was a really, really frustrating situation. And when the chief inspector realized this, he was really shocked. And as one of the speakers, I think Aaron, said about the mental consequences of being in the camp, you could easily see those consequences after some time, after a few months. People became more depressed, frustrated. They would most of them have had suicidal thoughts. And PTSD as well. One of my friends in the block that I was living in was a kid during Iran and Iraq war, and being in Napier repeatedly reminded him that he's in that situation. As a kid, he would always look for shelters to hide because of the bombs and shootings. And being in the camp reminded him of that environment and that atmosphere. He couldn't sleep without pills, and people were dealing with insomnia. That was a serious thing in Napier barracks. Also, we had 1 nurse on site, and for sure that person was not adequate for 400 people. People were dealing with dental problems, with mental issues, and so many other physical issues, and they couldn't really manage to help everyone. We had also scabies in the camp. It was quite contagious. Scabies were really common in the camp. And I tell others, always tell others that I used to consider myself as a completely physically and mentally healthy person. But now I'm dealing with a great deal of anxiety and also insomnia. So imagine the victims of torture and persecution, how they are feeling now after being moved out of the camp. Also, the current, especially after the fire, I forgot the fire. When the fire happened, we were kept in the dark places for 2 or 3 days without electricity, heating, hot water, and people were really, really, I would say, depressed. I mean, if I have to use the word depressed, distressed, and anxious, but really the words cannot describe how we felt during those times. You didn't have your basic needs, electricity, your mobile would not work if you didn't have electricity, and people were more cut off from the world outside, and that was really, really painful. And after some time, when I was moved out from the camp, and also other former residents were moved out from the camp, we finally felt that we are respected, we are having dignity, decency, something that were really taken off from us. And the current residents, when the current residents were moved in, I were in contact with some of them for a few weeks, and they were quite, let's say, hopeful that this is not the case. They're not going to be there for a long time, and they are processing their substantive interview, and everything's going to be over sooner or later. But it was like a few days ago that I was talking to one of the current residents, and he was one of those who were hopeful in the beginning. And when he was talking to me a few days ago, it was visible. It was visible that he was really, really depressed. He wasn't optimistic about his future, and he also had some negative thoughts about his situation. And you could see that how this accommodation, how these camps affect people mentally. And right after that, I tried to tell people, the UK people, British people who are living in this country, tell them and spread the word about how the asylum system works and how the situation is in army camps. I also wrote a letter to the public after I was moved out, and I shared it on social media. And it was published on The Guardian. And as I mentioned on that letter, we could really feel that we were dehumanized, criminalized. We didn't commit any crime, but we were unlawfully detained, as High Court said. We were unlawfully detained, and we didn't receive the basic needs, the fundamental basic needs, mental support and physical health support. And that was really painful. It was 4 months. 4 months is easy to say, but it was like years for me, ages for me. I really don't like to see other people going through this and living in this kind of accommodations. I was really happy to hear the High Court verdict about Napier Barracks. But the thing is, we don't have to give up, because people are still there and Napier Barracks is still open and the hostile environment still exists. So if Napier closed, the chance that they are going to build another place like Napier is really high. The chance is really high. So I think we have to spread the word about the hostile environment, about the asylum system, and about the Home Office, how the Home Office criminalize or dehumanize asylum seekers. And maybe we are going to see some changes in our world, hopefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Irfan, and thank you for your bravery, as Sheila has talked about in the chat, in speaking about your experience whilst you were in Napier, writing from there, but also in the sort of weeks and months that followed. I had a question. I hope this isn't too sensitive to ask, but are you still there?
Yes. Sorry, my internet connection sometimes is really bad, so I turn off the video. But yeah, I'm here.
How do you feel today about speaking publicly about your experiences? Do you feel safe to be talking about it, and you've got a bit of a platform now? Do you feel that you can capitalize on that?
You mean about the safeguarding issues, you mean?
No, about do you feel safe today?
Oh yeah.
On the basis of your status and on the basis of, I guess, having a little bit of a public profile, do you feel safe to carry on talking about your experiences? And
yeah, that's fine. Because I personally don't believe that I'm doing something wrong. So yeah, that's fine.
Okay, good. All right. I want to open it up for questions and discussion. Before doing so, I just wanted to circle back to where we started, which is to Zoe, and just to ask Zoe, when you finished your talk, you gave us some sort of practical pointers about things that people could do. Having heard this sort of testimony and the sort of accumulation of experience that MSF has, I was wondering if there's anything else you think we should be doing that maybe we're currently not. And I was also wondering if you what you think about joining up the sort of the advocacy and kind of the narrative about the UK kind of immigration policy with the FCDO cuts that obviously we have been watching unfold over the kind of last weeks with some horror, also bearing in mind the fact that for quite a long time now, the UK have been sort of justifying their approach to immigration on the basis of we address these problems at source. So our aid budget acts as provides basically reason for people not to move. So can we more effectively sort of join up those two pieces of advocacy work?
Thanks for that question. That's a really important one. And I apologize, I've moved a bit to try to get away from it, but there may be some cooking sounds in the background, so I hope it's not too distracting. Thanks to the really brilliant presentations that we've heard since I last spoke to you, and especially to Irfan, thank you very much for that really important testimony, and for your bravery for speaking up about these issues as they've affected you personally. I think you raise a really important point Vicky, about sort of international development and where that conversation fits in, and where our sort of international role. They like to just portray themselves as global Britain these days, and what that really means, and where the hypocrisies lie within that. I think it's a really important area of advocacy. I think the conversation that we've been having today really shows, to a large extent, how global this conversation really is, and how the actions that are taken by one government really do impact people around the world, and the actions that can be taken elsewhere as well, and that open up a realm of possibility and norms that can be violated. And so I think that it is really important to consider our role in developing countries within that. I would, however, say that there's a need to be cautious. I think it's unconscionable that we're cutting our contribution to foreign aid. It's clearly just sort of a very, very negative thing to do, just from a purely moral standpoint. I think that there is a need to be slightly careful about playing into exactly that narrative that you highlighted so well, about how foreign aid is somehow a cure for migration. The one thing that we know for absolutely certain is that people move. People move, they have moved, they will move. None of the borders and none of the changes in governments, and none of the repression, and none of the wars, and none of the democratization processes, and none of the growth and movement away from extreme poverty in some parts of the world have actually ever stopped that. Human beings just do move. And I think that we need to be careful that while we say, that there's obvious moral arguments for supporting people either in refugee camps or just supporting development around the world and supporting the growth of equality around the world, I think that will never be a solution to migration. The evidence shows that, as countries develop, they don't, their peoples don't migrate less. If anything, they have the opportunity to potentially migrate a little more, at least in the medium term of development. And I think that really, and I'm going to, go rhetorically as far as I want to here, but obviously in practical policy terms, this isn't what we're advocating right now. But really, what would force us to seriously address global inequality would be the genuine free movement of people across borders globally. Because then we couldn't trap people in countries where they're abused. We couldn't trap people in countries where they don't have the same opportunities as us for prosperity and stability. And then we would really have to, we would by definition have a complete reordering of this global inequality that we see. So. It's kind of like how Priti Patel is trying to defang the arguments for safe routes for refugees by saying, yeah, of course we'll give safe routes to refugees, just this many who are being resettled, who Priti Patel will handpick the most deserving, and everybody else. The reality is that doesn't solve the problem for the vast majority of people. And the reality is that international development aid is extremely important, but will not solve the need for people to move and to migrate. So I think that it's a difficult one in terms of advocacy, because that needs to be balanced in our conversation. But I do think that it reveals a fundamental hypocrisy and the shallowness of this idea of global Britain that we're talking about. And I think that it also, sorry if I'm going on and on, this is a long answer, but just very quickly, I do also think that we're seeing these trade deals be announced now, and they very often have a sort of migration angle tacked on. So we don't have the details of the Australian one yet, but with the Indian deal that was announced recently, sort of, was touted as this sort of like, more legal routes for migration, and also a tougher enforcement of, people overstaying visas. But again, it introduced a really limited number of time-limited visas. So the people coming from India on those visas will get to the end of 2 years and have no option to extend or renew their stay. At which point, inevitably, some of them will stay because, people's circumstances change. That's life. That's the reality of human lives. And inevitably, therefore, because we give them no flexibility, no option of extending their stay, these temporary routes that I was banging on about earlier, they will become undocumented, some of them. And so they'll face the hostile environment and all of the difficulties that face all the migrants that we, delegitimize in this country. So the narrative around this global Britain that we're building is you scratch the surface very lightly, and you reveal a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of problems that are being stored up for the long term. So I think it's a really important area, but it's quite a complex one as well. I hope that's a useful answer.
Great, really interesting, Zoe. Thank you. Just wondering if anybody who's here wants to come in with a question or a point. Sheila, you've been busy posting links to parliamentary inquiries. I don't know if you want to give us any particular insights into which are the most important ones you think coming up that we should be trying to influence.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that.
Great.
Irfan sent me the link from Kent Live, I think it was, which was talking about how Chris Phelps was saying how wonderful it is now in Napier Camp, and that this had come up in Parliament. So one of the links I've put on there is the link to Hansard from that discussion, which is quite horrifying in a lot of ways because of the negative comments, but there are also some very powerful voices who advocate for people to be given the right to stay here and against that. The all-party parliamentary group on detention is a cross-party group of MPs who look at detention issues. When David Bolt, who was the Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, went to do his inspection, he involved the Inspector of Prisons as well, because this is a quasi-detention situation. And the people who are there fall between two stools, so they don't have the rights that you have in detention. They don't have the facilities that you have if you're in detention, because you're not there it's not a detention centre. And this group, the APPG link that I've put up, I've got an inquiry to try and work out where the lack of protection is. And what I would say is that what I'm hearing about Penally is that camp closed because there was an awful lot of rise up against it, but it actually closed at the time when the contract finished. And Napier Camp contract finishes in September. And what they were saying in Parliament last week was that they asked him, is it going to close in September? And he was very vague, saying basically, if the locals don't like it, then we have to listen to them. What this APPG is looking at is not just Napier, it's looking at the principle of using these kinds of establishments. So Hassockfield, which is they're going to turn into a detention centre for women. And I think that is such an important issue. I mean, my basic thing is give people indefinite leave to remain. But, if we can chip away at the edges, it is bring people into the community, don't stick them on Ascension Island. And the Tories just want them out of sight and out of mind. We have to work really hard against that. So there's loads of things I could say, but I would just leave it like that for now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sheila, for that pointer. Frank, do you want to come in? Frank, we don't hear you. You're still on mute if you wanted to say something.
Apologies.
There you go.
No.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Frank Arnold, Forest Medical, question about the way in which vulnerable people are not being screened out of being brought to Napier, because something like 1 in 6 of all the people brought there since it was reopened have been moved out again because they've been found to be vulnerable. And it would appear that some kind of screening is being done in the camp by the nurse or the staff. And that is both disturbing and potentially dangerous for any belated subsequent asylum claims, because if what appears in the nurse's report as sent to the Home Office, saying this person is vulnerable, contradicts what they subsequently say in a witness statement or an asylum interview, it is going to be held that they are being inconsistent and therefore lying. Does anybody have any knowledge about the way in which the nurse appears to be conducting such interviews and examinations?
Okay. I don't know if anybody... Is there anybody who would like to speak to that? Zoe?
I can have a go. So you're absolutely right, Frank, about the problem. So the case that was brought against the use of the Napier barracks in particular the other week, we represented some of the clients who took that case, and they were all of them victims of survivors of trafficking, torture, you know, people who are classified by the Home Office's own classifications as totally unsuitable for this kind of accommodation. So, the judgment found, and the independent reports have found that, yeah, there is a real problem with the lack of trained Home Office staff on site, and that there's a systemic problem with the screening that is taking place. So it's not just a few individuals who ended up getting through and who ended up taking that court case, but there's actually a problem with the screening system, which in theory means that the system for screening people before they're put into that camp needs to be reviewed and changed by the Home Office. And the problem is that what we often see, and you know, this government is really makes a priority of trying to avoid accountability and scrutiny. And unless you have really well-informed press or particularly interested MPs to actually follow that up and make sure, you know, and expose whether or not it's happening, you know, the processes by which these people are screened are very opaque, and they can say, oh, yeah, it's all working fine now. And it's very difficult to know whether it really is. And we, of course, doubt the word of the Home Office in any such matters. And then the danger is that you just sort of get to a point again where this builds up into another problem, bring another case. And progress is really difficult to achieve. So, yeah, sorry not to have a fully clear answer on that, but it definitely is a problem that we've seen.
Okay. Frank, did you want to come in again?
Very simply, if anybody hears of any further information about that kind of interaction with the nurse or staff, it would be worth bringing it to our organization, because this is analogous to a Rule 35 report done out of detention. And the analogy with detention is all too precise.
Okay, great. All right, I think we have our own coordinator. I can see George online as well, so that's definitely noted from our side. Fran, I saw your hand go up.
Can you hear me?
Yes, brilliantly.
Okay, perfect. Just listening to everybody, particularly in places like Napier or the hotels or places where people are being detained, do they have any access to legal support? One of the reasons to actually ask that is certainly, I mean, working in the NHS, if we do have people coming through, asylum seekers, unaccompanied minors, one of the things that I'm asking the teams is, okay, has anybody requested, is there any legal support in there, and have they actually requested a medical legal report? Because without that, then anybody can do what they like the nurse at Napier can say what she likes, where she likes. But the request for that medical report has to come via a solicitor. So do they have access to legal support?
Okay, thanks, Fran. Fan.
Yes,
from your experience.
Yeah, in the beginning when I was there, we were not really in contact with the legal representatives, both immigration solicitors and public law solicitors. We weren't aware of public law solicitors who can help us being moved out of the camp. we didn't know there is such a thing as public law solicitors who can help us about the accommodation. But now there are so many organizations around Napier which are helping the residents by providing immigration solicitors and also public law solicitors. This is what I'm aware of. And also, I think there are so many medical organizations or institutes, maybe Frank can provide more information, are working on doing some medical assessments. And I think now there is less pressure on the nurse on site, I believe, but maybe others can give more information. But thank you.
Does anybody else want to jump in? No. Frank, you got anything to add to that, or Zoe?
Quick question, if I may.
Go ahead.
It seems to us that it's easier for people to find a public law solicitor than an immigration solicitor, and I'm astonished that there have been remarkably few requests that we've seen for medical legal reports. I'm not sure why that is. It may be that people are having trouble getting in touch with immigration solicitors, or it may be that solicitors feel now is not the time to be doing that kind of work, which would be reasonable, because subjecting somebody to the rigors of a couple of hours of digging into the horrors of what happened to them while they're in Napier would be a pretty traumatic thing to do.
Zoe, your camera came on. Want to step in?
Yeah, I mean, all I would say is that the demand, the need for, high quality and also legal aid supported immigration representation and advice from solicitors drastically outstrips the supply that exists from organizations such as ourselves and others in the sector. We're all sort of, our legal team of 5-6 people just operates at 150% every day of the year, and it's a real issue, and it's to do with the long-term issues around cuts to legal aid funding. But yes, I would imagine that Napier, now that it's under so much scrutiny, is being accessed by more groups who will be doing adequate signposting, I would hope. But I think in general, this is just like a huge problem, and will be exacerbated by the same issue that like various people have brought up about, the Home Office's intention to keep people out of communities and out of cities and out of places where there are access to, citizens advice bureaus and charity law firms such as JCWI and others, and putting people in de facto detention outside of communities is going to exacerbate that problem, but it is definitely already one. And we're constantly having to sort of signpost people on because of our inability to take on any more cases. So yeah, it's a real problem, definitely. And I would assume lots of people are not getting the representation they need.
Okay, great. Thank you, Zoe, for that response. I think it's probably time to draw it to a close. We're coming up to the end of our time, and I'm conscious that we have colleagues here from Italy and Switzerland for whom it's even an hour later. So, Irfan, you've still got your hand up. Did you want to say a final comment?
No, sorry, I forgot to put it down. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Me too, sorry.
All right, no worries. Okay, so I just want to close with saying thank you. So thank you to all of you for being here and for caring. And I think, it speaks to obviously what Zoe was sort of exhorting us all to do at the end of her talk, which is to take practical action. Thank you to the Take Action group and the members there that are listed for organising tonight's event, which was really, really important, and some very important stories that have been told here this evening. And thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Zoe, thank you to MSF colleagues for the work that you're doing to keep these issues in the spotlight. And particularly, I want to finish with a thank you to Irfan, to being here, to speaking to us so eloquently about your experience. I'm really glad that you feel safe to continue doing so. It's so important to hear from people who have directly lived experience like yours. And I really hope that by continuing to do so, we can cut through the rhetoric around refugees and migrants and the way that that is weaponized, essentially in search for electoral success, because that's basically what it's all about. So really important to continue hearing your story, and that in exactly the way Zoe talked about it, hopefully we can connect it to people who care at the end of the day and who will take action accordingly. Yeah, that's it. Thanks very much for being here, and see you all at the next one, I hope.